Welcome to the Mini Book Podcast, African American Books Edition. Today we are discussing the profound work, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South by Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers. We thank you for listening, and please consider subscribing for future content. After hearing this presentation, we would encourage you to go out and purchase this book and support the author. Please note that the voices you are hearing come from AI, but the content comes straight from the book, and we feel that this is a great way to learn about African American history. This book, it really reframes our entire understanding of white women's role in the South. It just completely challenges that long-held myth that white women were, these passive bystanders insulated from the brutality of slavery by patriarchal protections.
It shatters it. The core argument here is that white slave-owning women were not only fully aware of slavery's, quote, most obnoxious features, but they were active participants. They profited from it, they defended the system, and their fundamental relationship to slavery was, at its very foundation, economic.
Economic, not maternal, not benevolent, but purely financial.
Exactly. It's all about the money.
Okay, so let's dig into that central contradiction, starting with the historical myth that Jones-Rogers just so systematically dismantles. This idea that Southern white women were sort of innocent, victims of patriarchy, kept in the dark about the system's cruelty. It was incredibly pervasive, even among abolitionists.
Oh, absolutely. It was a very, very convenient fiction. The book brings up sources like the journalist and editor James Redpath, who was writing back in 1859. Redpath toured the South, and he was trying to figure out why these women were so loyal to slavery.
And what was his conclusion?
His analysis was really built on a whole series of assumptions. He thought they were simply, quote, reared under the shadow of the peculiar institution, and were just constantly fed propaganda that slavery was a moral good.
So he basically assumed a profound ignorance on their part.
Profound ignorance. He argued they were purposefully insulated from it all. He claimed they never attend auctions, never witness examinations, seldom if ever see the Negroes lashed.
He genuinely believed that if they just knew slavery as it is, if they saw the brutal reality outside of their parlors, they would rise up and protest it.
And that belief system, which, lasted well into the 20th century among historians, it effectively gave white women a pass. It excused them from any moral culpability, any economic responsibility. It just blamed the entire massive edifice of slavery on white Southern men.
But the sources that this book relies on, especially the narratives of formerly enslaved people and all these antebellum legal documents, they tell a completely different and frankly a much uglier story.
A completely different story. The reality is that white women were masters in their own right. They managed, they sold, they inherited, and they applied violence, not just as, facilitators for their husbands, but as primary owners of their own domain.
That phrase, primary domain owner, that's so vital. It forces us to look beyond that stereotype of the plantation mistress who just, oversaw the domestic staff. The sources here show white women actively involved in things like heavy industry and really high-stakes market activity.
And we have a perfect and honestly a shocking illustration of this in the case of Martha Gibbs. A formerly enslaved man named Lit Young described her as a big, rich Irish woman who weren't scared of no man. And get this, she owned and operated a massive steam sawmill complex near Vicksburg, Mississippi.
A steam sawmill, that's not a small-time operation.
Not at all. We're talking an industrial capital venture. This isn't a domestic enterprise.
And Martha Gibbs didn't just delegate the oversight to her husband or some male manager.
No, Lit Young recounted that Gibbs personally oversaw her own overseer. He said she was on the work site almost every single morning and not in some, silk gown.
Right.
She was there with 2 guns buckled on, making sure everything ran efficiently.
2 guns. And what about her management style?
Young said she would outcuss a man when things didn't go right. I mean, that just shatters the whole delicate, sheltered Southern dull image, doesn't it?
Completely. She was a ruthless capitalist. She was deeply embedded in the most abrasive, violent parts of managing forced labor, an employer, a manager, and a property owner.
And the power dynamic between her and her husband, who was a physician, is incredibly revealing. Young remembered a time when her husband saw the brutal whippings the overseer was giving out, and he sort of mildly protested. He said, "Darling, you ought not to whip them poor black folks so hard. They's going to be free just like us sometimes."
Darling. So gentle. What was her reaction?
It was instant. It was definitive. She snapped back. "Shut up. Sometime I believe you as a Yankee anyway."
Wow.
So she's not only verbally shutting him down, she's correctly identifying his sentiment as a threat to the core economic system she depends on. And what happened later proves her right.
Her husband ended up serving the Union forces, right? Treating injured soldiers during the Civil War.
He did. It shows you her primary allegiance was to her economic assets, her sawmill, her property rights, not to the Confederacy's political cause, and certainly not to her husband's moral conscience.
And the story gets even darker. It becomes even more illustrative of her absolute devotion to her property right after the war ended. The Emancipation Proclamation was issued, the Confederacy surrendered, and Union officers even briefly arrested Gibbs. But what did she do when she got out?
This is one of the most audacious acts of post-war defiance you'll find in the sources. She had to technically free her enslaved people, but she absolutely refused to accept the economic loss.
So what was her plan?
She gathered up a group of her now free laborers, got 10 six-mule wagons, an ox-coke wagon, and this is the crucial part, she hired armed Irishman guards with rifles.
Armed guards.
And then she forced them on a 215-mile march from Mississippi all the way to Texas.
215 miles under armed guard. And to make sure they complied, the guards literally tied the men to trees at night.
This wasn't a voluntary move. It was sustained kidnapping and coerced labor, all justified by her belief in her property interest. She kept them in Texas for a whole year.
A whole year after the war.
Yes. They were forced to plant and harvest her first crop in Texas. It was only after she had extracted that labor, in June of 1866, a full year after they should have been free, that she finally let them go.
The Martha Gibbs case is just such a powerful encapsulation of the book's entire thesis.
It really is. It shows white women were capable of this aggressive, entrepreneurial brutality, defying the law, challenging federal authority, all to protect their financial stake in other human beings.
It demonstrates that their economic relationship to slavery was the final and most resilient loyalty they had.
And the story of Martha Gibbs shows us the adult woman asserting her ownership. But Jones-Rogers argues this deep economic attachment was intentionally cultivated from infancy. It wasn't an accident.
It was a curriculum.
It was a full immersion course in property rights and racial dominance.
Yeah.
The book really focuses on women who owned enslaved people in their own right, meaning they held direct legal title, often through inheritance. And this relationship was, as we said, pecuniary.
Can you break that down for us? What does pecuniary mean in this context?
It just means it's defined by money, by monetary worth and investment. This continuous multi-generational investment by women was absolutely foundational to the growth of American capitalism.
Which challenges the way we're usually taught history, focusing only on male industrialists or planters.
Exactly. And this instructional process is started with the earliest milestones of childhood. White girls were taught that human beings were disposable, transferable gifts, the ultimate luxury item.
You see the transfer of these property rights happening through gifts for birthdays, baptisms, holidays, and especially marriage.
It created this profound psychological link between personal success, celebration, and owning another human life. And we see these startling examples of infants owning other infants.
It's just mind-boggling. Mary Fuller Knight, for example, was given an enslaved girl named Rose, along with any future children Rose might have, when Mary was just 8 months old.
Think about that. An 8-month-old baby became a mistress, and Rose and her entire potential family line instantly became capital.
Fillmore Hancock, a formerly enslaved man, he recalled a similar situation. His grandmother was given to her old Mrs. when that Mrs. was only 1 year old.
And this practice was essential for cementing that young white girl's identity as a propertied woman long before she came of age or married. It gave her status, it gave her wealth, it gave her labor immediately.
This whole process was also helped along by some really significant changes in post-revolutionary law, specifically regarding inheritance. We should probably touch on the concept of primogeniture.
Right, so primogeniture, it comes from English common law, and it basically dictated that when a property owner died without a will, all the real property, usually land, went exclusively to the eldest son.
Which concentrated all the wealth and severely limited the property rights of daughters and any younger sons.
But after the American Revolution, southern states largely got rid of primogeniture. This was seen as a move toward more equality among the heirs.
But in the context of chattel slavery, it had a massive stabilizing effect on the entire institution.
It did, because it meant that property, including the increasingly valuable enslaved people, was legally divided up and distributed among all the heirs, male and female.
So this ensured that daughters were inheriting this highly liquid, highly valuable asset. It gave them independent wealth and solidified their status as slave owners much earlier and more securely.
And the moment that ownership was established, even in toddlers, the, quote, obscene logic of the system took hold. The book describes this quick shift from what might be childlike play to the assertion of absolute violent command.
The story of Lysiana Burwell is just tragic. At 3 years old, she had an enslaved companion named Fanny. One day, Lysiana gets vexed with Fanny, just a simple childish disagreement.
But because Lysiana already understood her absolute power, she ran to her father, John A. Burwell, and demanded he cut Fanny's ears off and get her a new maid from Clarksville.
A 3-year-old demanding mutilation and replacement. And what was the father's reaction?
He relayed the story later with convivial amusement. He thought it was funny.
He didn't correct her. He didn't teach her that was wrong.
No, he saw it as an amusing display of appropriate mastery. This incident just confirms that even a 3-year-old was fluent in the language of proprietary violence and disposability. Fanny wasn't a friend. She was a tool.
A tool subject to mutilation and replacement at a whim.
And this entitlement was reinforced over and over again by white parents who demanded that their daughters be given extreme deference by enslaved people, no matter the enslaved person's age.
This was drilled in through forced salutations, right?
Yes. George Womble recalled this chilling ceremony that happened the day after a white child was born. The owner would force all the enslaved people to line up and bow to the newborn infant, calling them young master or young mistress.
So a 1-day-old infant was already established as the ultimate authority figure.
And this demand for deference wasn't abstract. It was enforced with extreme brutality. Rebecca Jane Grant was beaten severely with a cowhide strap for refusing to use the required salutation.
What was it she said?
She recalled bitterly that she was whipped for not saying Master Henry to a 3- or 4-year-old boy. It's just this assertion of racial hierarchy that's so absolute, the youngest white child held ultimate power over adults.
The most heartbreaking example of this is the story of the enslaved woman who was put in a stock and beaten until her leg broke. Just because she forgot to call a 9-month-old miss.
The message was delivered physically, and it was definitive. There is no age limit on authority, and no lapse in deference will be tolerated, ever.
And this conditioning, it culminates in children not just witnessing, but internalizing extreme violence as just a routine part of daily life.
Right. The book brings in this horrific legal record from a court case, State of Georgia v. Green Martin. Martin was on trial for beating a 12- or 13-year-old boy named Alfred to death over 3 hours.
And his daughters were witnesses.
His 3 daughters, 2 of them minors, witnessed the entire thing, the choking, the kicking, the moment a saddle was placed on Alfred's back before he was beaten with a stick.
And when they were questioned by the court later, what one daughter, Catherine, said, it just sums up the success of this whole learner's curriculum.
Catherine testified that she chose not to intervene in the torture and murder because she did not want to. And she justified her inaction by saying the beating was not uncommon violence.
No uncommon violence. That's not just a shocking quote. It's a profound diagnostic statement about the moral universe these girls grew up in.
Absolutely. They were so desensitized that witnessing a protracted death, a torture session, was just part of the everyday routine. The final lesson in slave mastery was indifference.
The ability to observe extremity without intervening.
Which prepared them perfectly for the ruthless assertiveness they would need as property owners in a legally complex world.
And that ruthlessness, learned in childhood, it translated directly into economic and legal aggression when they came of age.
Which brings us to this complex intersection of gender, property, and the law. Specifically, the doctrine of coverture.
Coverture is one of those concepts that can be really hard for a modern audience to grasp. Can you break it down for us?
Sure. It was a common law doctrine from English law that governed the legal status of married women. Essentially, it said that when a woman got married, her legal identity was suspended or covered by her husband.
So she became, what was the term, femme covert?
A covered woman, exactly.
Huh?
She couldn't sue or be sued in her own name. She couldn't sign contracts or legally control any property she brought into the marriage. In a legal fiction, the husband and wife became one person. And that person was the husband.
Which sounds like an insurmountable barrier to a woman owning anything independently.
It sounds like it. Yet Jones-Rogers demonstrates that Southern slave-owning women were incredibly adept at bypassing, challenging, and manipulating coverture. They realized that while the law restricted their rights as women, it rigorously protected their rights as property owners.
So their primary loyalty was to their capital, not to gender norms.
That's the critical paradox. They and their families were masters of legal maneuvering. They took proactive steps to secure what were called separate estates.
And what were those?
These were legal instruments, usually marriage contracts, prenuptial agreements, or specific clauses written into wills. that transferred legal title of property, especially enslaved people, to a trustee, usually a brother or a father,
And that trustee would hold it for whose benefit?
for the wife's sole use and benefit. So even though the husband might manage the property day to day, the separate estate ensured he couldn't legally sell it without her consent, and his creditors couldn't seize it to pay off his debts.
So this was a direct, active effort by women and their families to safeguard their wealth from the potential financial recklessness of their husbands.
Exactly. And the financial stakes were high enough that it often flipped the traditional gender roles completely. The sources confirm that men in the South frequently married women because they owned human property.
The slaves a woman brought into a marriage were seen as financial bait.
Precisely. A ready source of capital and labor for the new family. This meant that white men were often financially dependent on the wealth their wives inherited, which created a profound strain on the whole patriarchal ideal.
You even see this in political letters of the time. Abigail Adams advised her son John Quincy not to marry a woman with property until he had enough of his own, warning him not to be indebted to his wife for his property.
And in the slave-owning South, that indebtedness was routine. Women effectively became their husbands' creditors and financiers.
And when those financial interests were threatened, these women did not hesitate to assert themselves legally.
Not at all. They used their property rights to challenge male dominance. They were willing to sue their own husbands, their husbands' creditors, even their own relatives in public court to defend their assets.
So the courts really were a battleground for female property assertion. One of the most fascinating anecdotes that shows how widespread this legal knowledge was involves an enslaved person, a woman named Winnie.
Yes, the story of Winnie in Kentucky is amazing. She successfully sued for her freedom. Her whole case hinged on the fact that her deceased mistress, Elizabeth Stout Whitehead, had signed a prenuptial contract that stipulated Winnie's manumission, her freedom.
But the document was lost.
It was lost, and the white heirs were trying to claim Winnie as property. But Winnie, the enslaved person, used her intimate knowledge of the household's legal dealings, the gossip she'd heard, to testify to the contract's existence and even the specifics of its terms.
She knew the legal details that the white heirs had either overlooked or just lost track of.
Winnie's success underscores a crucial point. The enslaved community was intensely monitoring the legal and financial maneuvers of their owners. They understood that the slightest shift in ownership or legal status could be leveraged for their own freedom.
So for Winnie, her mistress's legal foresight, which was intended to protect property, ultimately secured human freedom.
Exactly. And this assertion of control wasn't just limited to lawsuits. It was a domestic affair that often involved physical confrontation. Again, not for benevolence, but for proprietary protection.
This brings us to the case of Sarah Davis Parnell.
Right. Sarah Davis Parnell's husband was a heavy drinker, and when he was drunk, he would frequently beat their enslaved people without mercy. Sarah would often interrupt him, grabbing the whip right out of his hand mid-strike. And her famous quote, asserting her ownership rights, was, "I didn't come all the way here from North Carolina to have my niggers beat up for nothing."
That statement is just. It's utterly devoid of sympathy. She wasn't stopping the brutality because she cared about the enslaved person.
Not at all. She was stopping it because her husband's drink and rage was destroying her capital assets. A severely beaten, disabled, or traumatized enslaved person was worth significantly less money on the market.
It was purely a proprietary defense mechanism.
Purely. And the courts consistently backed these women, showing that coverture wasn't some rigid, monolithic barrier. White women used the law, often more successfully than their husbands, to protect their chattel, which just cemented their profound economic investment in the whole system.
They were capitalists fighting patriarchal restrictions to protect their property.
And that intense focus on assets leads us directly into the market economy. The traditional historical view always suggested that the slave market was this exclusively male domain.
Right, that it was too rough, too public, and too morally or sexually charged for ladies.
But Jones-Rogers argues that the slaveholding household was, itself, an extension of the market.
It wasn't some isolated domestic sphere.
Not at all. The home was a site of coerced production, coerced reproduction, and rampant violence, both physical and sexual. The fact that the market was brutal was irrelevant because the brutality was already happening inside their homes every day.
The book illustrates this by continuing the story of the Burwell family, the father of 3-year-old Lizzie Anna, John A. Burwell.
The sources confirm that he openly engaged in adultery and sexual assault with his wife's enslaved woman. and he would often summon her to his room right in front of his young daughter.
This sexual violence wasn't just a domestic issue, it was an integral part of the economic system.
Exactly. The enslaved woman was property, and the husband felt entitled to use that property any way he wished, including for sexual exploitation, often with the full knowledge of his wife, who was the legal owner.
Which just refutes that whole idea that white women were too delicate for the market. They were living inside its most violent, sexualized realities every single day.
And they were direct market participants. They orchestrated sophisticated financial transactions right from their drawing rooms. They didn't need to go down to the docks or the trading pens.
They just summoned the traders to their homes.
They summoned the traders to them to transact purchases, sales, and exchanges. And by all accounts, they were fierce negotiators. The book says they were not meek in their bargaining.
They were showing sophisticated financial acumen, discussing the price, the health, the skill set of the human beings they were trading.
They were investors making calculated decisions about their portfolio.
But their presence wasn't always so private. Women were also highly visible consumers, even tourists, at the most public auctions.
Yes, Dr. John Theophilus Kramer, observing an auction in the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans around 1859, he noted the presence of 4 ladies who were splendidly dressed in black silk and satin and glittering with precious jewels.
And he noted they were sitting close to the platform without male escorts.
Without male escorts, they were there as interested parties, calculating the value of the human bodies on display, listening intently to the bids and the warranties being offered on people. It just completely dissolves that myth of the sheltered Southern lady.
And the motives for these transactions could be so shockingly trivial. One formerly enslaved person recalled the agony of being sold because his mistress sold him, not because she was in debt or facing ruin.
But simply so she could afford to buy a new dress.
That one anecdote is a window into the casual cruelty of it all, of treating people as just fungible capital, a human life traded for a non-essential consumer good.
It strips away any pretense of paternalism and shows the direct link between a woman's consumption habits and the slave market.
And here's where the market involvement becomes highly specialized and uniquely driven by female demand. The invisible market for enslaved wet nurses.
This system depended entirely on white women prioritizing their own comfort or their infant's health over the humanity of an enslaved woman.
The demand for wet nurses was so high that the ability to suckle was commodified. It became a specialized, skilled form of labor.
White women would often refuse to breastfeed their own children due to social norms or fears of fiscal strain, so they would advertise extensively to hire or buy enslaved women, specifically emphasizing their body's market value. The ads often sought women who were wet nurses or, even more crudely, breeders.
This brings us to a really critical concept the book introduces, maternal violence. And we should define this carefully. It's not about an enslaved mother harming her child.
No. Maternal violence, in this specific historical context, describes the systemic and psychological violence that white mothers perpetrated against enslaved women in their role as caregivers. The very act of hiring a wet nurse required separating that woman from her own child, preventing maternal bonding, and appropriating her most essential bodily product, her breast milk.
And this was often done at the height of the enslaved woman's own grief.
Right. White women frequently forced enslaved mothers to suckle white babies shortly after those enslaved women had lost their own infants, either to death or, worse, to being sold away to another state.
It's the ultimate act of appropriation, of labor, of body, of motherhood itself.
And the economic calculation behind it was cold and precise. If an enslaved woman's milk was directed toward the white infant, she was immediately unavailable to nurse her own child. Slave owners actively calculated these financial risks.
They were weighing the value of one child versus the other.
They were. If the enslaved woman's own child survived, it eventually became property on their books. But if she was forced into wet nursing, the focus shifted entirely to maximizing the value of her milk for the white family, reinforcing her status purely as a reproductive commodity.
Finally, we have to look at the darkest edge of this female-driven market: female slave traders and brothel owners.
This really demonstrates that women profited from every single form of exploitation, including the sexual degradation of other women.
Figures like Matilda Raymond and Mary Taylor are stark examples.
They were. These women purchased enslaved women specifically to compel them to work as prostitutes in their brothels. They were highly successful, aggressive businesswomen operating in the most morally compromised sector of the market.
And crucially, their business model involved monetizing the same person over and over and over again.
It wasn't just selling a fancy girl, once as a male trader might. These female owners acted as traders who profited reputedly night after night from selling the most intimate parts of these enslaved women's bodies to customers.
And according to the laws of property,
Every dollar earned by the enslaved prostitute, every wage collected from every customer, belonged entirely to the female owner.
it just demonstrates that white women weren't just co-conspirators in the domestic sphere, they were active, controlling profiteers in the commercial sexual exploitation of other women.
It confirms their economic stake transcended any perceived gender limitations or domestic confines.
So as the Civil War began, this intense, lifelong economic attachment that white women had to slavery really dictated their actions and their reactions to the idea of abolition.
For the vast majority of slave owners, and that's the 75% who owned 10 slaves or less human property, was their largest, most liquid asset. It was often their only means of financial survival and social status.
It was their retirement plan, their collateral, their labor force, all in one.
Exactly. So emancipation was viewed in purely economic terms, not as a moral imperative, but as a catastrophic, unprecedented financial loss.
It was, in their view, a robbery that threatened to erase their wealth, their status, their entire economic security, and force them into a state of dependency they had desperately fought to avoid.
And this financial panic fueled this intense wartime resistance. When white men left to fight for the Confederacy, slave-owning women found themselves isolated on plantations, often surrounded by dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people who suddenly sensed that freedom was near.
And they were terrified, not primarily of the Union Army.
No, they were terrified of losing their property. They appealed constantly, desperately, to Confederate government officials, arguing that the absence of white men left them in a very unprotected condition.
Their priority was getting military protection to stop their enslaved property from running away to federal lines or just asserting their freedom.
They saw the Confederate government as an insurer of their chattel. They relentlessly petitioned for compensation for slaves lost to impressment when the Confederate Army took slaves for military labor or for those who successfully fled.
Which just shows their legalistic, proprietary view of the situation. If the government lost their property, the government owed them money.
And as the war drew to a close and defeat became inevitable, some of these women focused fiercely on one final act, maximizing their profit before their assets became worthless. They engaged in frantic last-minute sales.
Henry Kirk Miller's recollection is a perfect and heartbreaking example of this final economic calculation.
It is. His mistress, fully aware that a Union victory was imminent and emancipation was literally days away, quickly sold his sister for 15 bales of cotton.
And Miller's observation of the situation just cuts right to the quick. He said, she was smart, wasn't she? She knew freedom was right there.
She chose financial maximization over any remaining shred of humanity or morality. She prioritized liquid capital right up until the very last legal moment.
And that relentless calculation didn't stop in 1865.
Not at all. It persisted long after emancipation became law. White women were deeply resistant to accepting their economic loss. They rejected the concept of compensated black labor. They often preferred the obedience of slavery to the impertinence of a system where they actually had to pay wages.
So they enforced coercive labor contracts, demanding unpaid work, and they exploited the chaotic post-war circumstances to retain control, especially over children.
Many women actively seized formerly enslaved children, leveraging the fragmentation of families caused by the war and by sale.
They would just claim these children and refuse to release them back to their parents.
Yes, and the sources even show women proudly using racial slurs, sometimes calling a child her little Confederate nigger, asserting this defiant proprietary claim over them even after slavery had legally ended. They preferred the status and subservience of slavery over the complications of a wage labor system.
And this defiance, this proprietary resentment, it culminates in the construction of the myth of the lost cause.
In the decades after 1865, former slave-owning women played a crucial role in constructing this pervasive cultural narrative that redefined the war and the institution of slavery itself.
They systematically omitted all evidence of their own brutality and, most critically, they completely erased their fierce, lifelong economic self-interest.
They wrote books, they established memorial associations, they spoke publicly, and they portrayed themselves as purely benevolent civilizers.
In this new narrative they constructed, they supported slavery because it was God's own plan and a positive good for Africans, not because it was a system of capital generation.
They lamented the loss of the tender tie that existed between mistress and servant, mourning the loss of their property and their traditional status, completely obscuring their identity as ruthless mistresses in the market.
And this historical sanitization, it served an immense political function.
Immense. By distancing themselves from the physical violence and the cold economic exploitation that sustained slavery, they positioned themselves as the moral guardians of Southern society. And this allowed them to take a central, unapologetic role in upholding post-war white supremacy, racial segregation, and the economic oppression of Black Americans.
They rewrote history to secure their continued political and social dominance.
So what Jones-Rogers makes undeniable is that white women were not peripheral figures. They were essential pillars of the slave economy.
They mastered the market, they manipulated the law, they trained their children in violence, and they used every legal and financial tool available to them to sustain and profit from slavery right up until the very end.
They were fundamentally co-conspirators, using their property rights and proprietary violence to ensure their wealth and their status. And by exposing the depth of their economic investment, this book forces us to retire, once and for all, the myth of the gentle, sheltered Southern lady.
We hope this presentation on They Were Her Property by Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers has provided valuable insights into African American history. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe and tell others about this mini book podcast. We would also love to hear your suggestions for future episodes. Please comment with the titles and authors of African American history books you would like us to cover next. Thank you for subscribing and listening.